The tension in the air was so thick you could almost slice it with a knife. Every pair of eyes in the conference hall snapped to the tall woman who had just walked through the grand double doors, her presence commanding the room without her having to say a single word. The glossy marble floors echoed softly under the click of her heels, and for a split second, silence reigned. But then the whispers started. They rippled from table to table, executives leaning toward one another with smirks and rolled eyes, their voices dripping with arrogance as if they had just spotted an intruder in a place she didn't belong. And then it came, the comment that cut through the low hum like a dagger. Who invited her? The words weren't whispered. They were practically spat out, loud enough to make heads turn and a few chuckles break free. The man who said it sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a smug grin plastered across his face, his designer suit almost gleaming under the chandelier lights. His tone was filled with mockery, his posture screaming superiority. The insult wasn't hidden. It was meant to sting, meant to remind her that she was an outsider in their world of old money and closed doors. But the woman didn't flinch. She didn't stumble, didn't look away, didn't show even the slightest crack in her armor. Instead, she let the words hang in the air, let the weight of his arrogance build, and with each step forward, she seemed to grow taller, stronger, as though the insult had only fueled her resolve. What none of them knew, what none of them could even imagine, was that this woman was not someone to be dismissed. She wasn't there by accident, and she wasn't some assistant who had wandered into the wrong room. She wasn't a token face or a guest looking to prove herself. She was a storm, silent and powerful, about to break right over their empire. And in the next few moments, the carefully constructed walls these men had spent years building, the empire they bragged about, the wealth they clung to, the respect they demanded, would all begin to crumble at her hands. The irony was thick. They believed they owned the future, that no one could challenge their grip on power. Yet here she stood, a woman they had already written off without even knowing her name. That was their first mistake. Underestimating her would be their downfall. The grand hall itself was a symbol of their arrogance. Tall glass windows stretching to the ceiling, walls lined with portraits of past tycoons, every detail screaming wealth and exclusivity. The invitation-only event was supposed to be a private summit where decision-makers gathered to shape industries, make deals behind closed doors, and secure their grip on the economy. Every chair at that table belonged to someone with power, someone who believed they were untouchable. And then she arrived, uninvited in their eyes, though in reality she had been personally called to attend by someone far above their rank. But they didn't know that. All they saw was a black woman in a room where they didn't think she belonged. That was enough for them to sneer, to whisper, to laugh. They didn't realize that her presence wasn't just valid. It was about to rewrite everything they thought they controlled. One executive leaned to another and muttered, "She's probably here to pitch some startup idea. Waste of time." Another chuckled, shaking his head as if the very sight of her offended his sense of order. It was as if they were all children, ganging up on someone they thought was weaker, certain that their laughter was enough to push her out. But she didn't come to leave quietly. She came to stay. As she reached the center of the room, her gaze swept across the men seated before her, and for the first time, they caught a glimpse of the steel in her eyes. There was no nervousness, no desperation for approval, no attempt to shrink herself into their expectations. Instead, there was quiet confidence, the kind that made people uncomfortable because it couldn't be shaken. She had seen men like this before countless times, men who built their legacies on keeping others out, men who thrived on underestimating anyone who didn't look like them, men who laughed at first, then panicked when the ground beneath them began to crack, and it was about to crack. The insult, "Who invited her?" wasn't just words to her. It was fuel. It was the match to the fire she had been waiting to ignite. Because she hadn't come to this hall just to sit politely and listen. She had come with something none of them expected. She had come with the power to dismantle everything they thought was indestructible. Every second she stood there, her silence was louder than their whispers. The room, so used to being controlled by the booming voices of men who thought they owned it, was now hanging on her stillness, her refusal to react the way they wanted her to. They wanted her flustered, embarrassed, humiliated, Instead, she was unshaken. And that unsettled them in a way they couldn't admit out loud. If only they had looked closer, they would have seen the signs. The tailored suit she wore wasn't borrowed, it was hers. The tablet she carried wasn't a prop, it was a weapon. And the composure on her face wasn't naivety. It was the calm before a storm. Because the truth was, this wasn't just another summit. This wasn't just another meeting. This was the beginning of their downfall. And the woman they had just mocked, the one they had reduced to a punchline, was the one holding the keys to their destruction. As the chandelier lights glittered above and the echoes of their laughter faded, the stage was set. The empire that looked so solid was already shaking, and they didn't even know it yet. All they saw was someone they thought didn't belong. All she saw was a table full of men who had no idea what was about to hit them. And with that, the story truly began. The moment the words, "Who invited her?" left that executive's lips, the countdown started. A countdown to exposure, to chaos, to the fall of an empire that believed it could never be touched. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room isn't the loudest, the richest, or the one sitting at the head of the table. Sometimes it's the one you didn't see coming, the one you underestimated, the one who walks in quietly, lets you laugh, lets you dismiss her, and then, in a matter of moments, takes everything you thought you controlled and tears it down. And she was about to do exactly that. Her name was Maya Carter, and unlike the smug executives who were sitting at that table, she hadn't inherited her position or bought her way in with old family money. She had carved it out of nothing, built it from the ground up with nothing more than her mind, her persistence, and the determination to prove wrong every person who ever doubted her. Her story wasn't one of privilege, it was one of grit. While the men in the room had been cushioned by private schools and billion-dollar networks, Maya had started out working from a cramped apartment with a second-hand laptop that overheated if it was left running too long. The empire she built wasn't the product of shady deals or insider connections. It was the product of sleepless nights, endless sacrifice, and the kind of vision you can't buy. Yet here she stood, facing men who looked at her as if she were invisible, as if her success didn't count because it hadn't been built their way. And that was their mistake. They thought success had to come with a silver spoon. They thought power only mattered if it came with a last name that could open doors. But Maya had kicked down doors they thought were locked, and in doing so, she had built something far more dangerous than privilege. She had built credibility. This gathering wasn't meant for outsiders. It was the kind of event where handshakes carried more weight than contracts, where deals were whispered over brandy and cigars, where money circled in ways that regulators would never trace. Behind the polished speeches and glossy presentations, it was a boys' club masquerading as an innovation summit. They liked to call themselves decision-makers, as if the entire world bent to their signatures. But Maya knew better. She had studied them, watched their moves, tracked the way they manipulated markets and crushed competitors under the guise of business strategy. What they called progress, she called exploitation. What they called leadership, she called bullying. And she had come prepared to expose it. From the moment she introduced herself, the air thickened with hostility. She could feel it in the way their eyes narrowed, in the way their smirks widened as if daring her to prove herself. One of them, Richard, the same man who had mocked her entrance, leaned back in his leather chair like a king on his throne, smirking as though he had already won a battle that hadn't even begun. His voice dripped with condescension as he said, "Miss Carter, I think you're in the wrong place. This summit is for decision-makers, not visitors." He paused before that last word, twisting it like a knife. The implication clear. She was an intruder, not an equal. The laughter that followed was sharp, cruel, and hollow, bouncing off the walls like echoes of an old joke they had told too many times. It was the same laughter she had heard when she first pitched her company to investors who told her she wasn't marketable. The same laughter she had heard when she applied for funding and was told her idea was too ambitious. The same laughter she had heard all her life from people who underestimated her simply because she didn't look like them. But instead of wounding her, that laughter had become her fuel. So she didn't fire back with words. She didn't try to defend herself or beg for their respect. Respect, after all, wasn't given in this world, it was taken. She let the laughter roll over her like water on stone, her expression calm, unreadable. Then, slowly, deliberately, she placed her briefcase on the table and opened it with a soft click. From inside, she pulled out a sleek tablet, its black glass screen gleaming under the chandelier light. She laid it in front of her like a sword on the battlefield. The room quieted, curiosity breaking through their arrogance. Some of them exchanged looks, as if wondering whether she was about to embarrass herself further. Richard smirked, shaking his head as though he was indulging a child's game. "What are you going to show us, Miss Carter? A pitch deck? Another dream looking for investors?" His words were sharp, but his tone was casual, mocking. He thought he had control. He thought she was there to ask for something, to beg for scraps from their table. But Maya wasn't there to beg. She wasn't there to pitch. She was there to pull the rug out from under every single man in that room. As she powered on the tablet, the large display at the front of the hall flickered to life. The executives leaned back, half distracted, already dismissing her as if this was another startup trying to sell them a product. At first, the screen filled with simple graphs, clean lines of data, statistics that didn't seem all that different from the endless charts they saw every day. Some yawned. One of them even pulled out his phone, scrolling carelessly while pretending to listen. But then the graphs shifted. The numbers changed, and what appeared next froze the smirks on their faces. It wasn't a pitch. It wasn't a hopeful business plan. It was evidence. Page after page of documents appeared on the screen. Financial records, transaction logs, confidential contracts. Every number, every signature, every account tied directly to them. Fraud, tax evasion, insider trading, shell companies hiding billions overseas, backroom deals that crushed smaller businesses, and stole opportunities from competitors who never stood a chance. The laughter stopped. The arrogance drained from their faces. One man leaned forward, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Another shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sweat breaking across his forehead. The man with the phone dropped it onto the table with a loud thud. And then Maya spoke, her voice calm, steady, slicing through the silence like a knife. "I'm not here to pitch. I'm not here to ask for anything. I'm here to show you that the empire you built on corruption and arrogance is about to collapse. Every file you're looking at has already been sent to regulators, journalists, and watchdog organizations. Every fraudulent deal, every stolen dollar, every signature, it's all documented. And it all leads back to you." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, these so-called decision-makers looked powerless. Their world, the one they had kept carefully guarded behind walls of wealth and privilege, was cracking open in front of them. Richard tried to laugh, but it came out forced, shaky, almost desperate. "You think you can bring us down with a few files? You don't know what you're up against." But even as he spoke, his voice betrayed him. His hands trembled. His confidence was unraveling. Maya didn't respond with anger. She didn't need to. She simply tilted her head, her calm gaze cutting deeper than any threat could. "I know exactly what I'm up against," she said softly. "And that's why I came prepared." At that moment, they began to understand. She wasn't just another name. She wasn't an outsider looking in. She was the one holding the matches, and their empire was nothing but dry timber waiting to burn. The lights in the room dimmed, and the large screen at the front of the hall glowed brighter, pulling every unwilling eye toward it. At first, the executives shifted in their seats with impatience, convinced that Maya's little show was nothing more than another attempt to impress them. They were men who had seen hundreds of presentations in their lives, and they thought they had seen it all. But as the data began to unfold, their smirks faltered, their chuckles died, and for the first time the energy in the room shifted. The first few slides were harmless enough. Line graphs, bar charts, growth trends. To an outsider it looked like any other business report. But Maya knew exactly how to capture their attention. She started small, showing numbers they recognized. Their numbers, market shares, investment flows, acquisition histories, then like a magician slowly revealing her trick. She dug deeper, peeling back the layers until the truth was naked in front of them. Transaction logs began to flash across the screen. Millions transferred between shell accounts. Payments funneled through obscure offshore entities. contracts signed under fake subsidiaries. Each figure was stamped with time, date, and the names of the very men sitting at that table. What had once been secrets buried under mountains of encrypted files and legal jargon now glared at them in bold, undeniable clarity. A low murmur rippled through the room. One man leaned forward, squinting at the numbers, as though if he stared hard enough, they might change. Another shifted in his seat, tugging nervously at his tie. And then came the first gasp when Maya displayed a contract signed years ago, an acquisition deal that had made headlines at the time. Praised as visionary leadership. On the screen, the truth unfolded. It hadn't been leadership. It had been theft. The contract revealed that the smaller company had been deliberately undervalued, its assets stripped and sold at double profit to a shell corporation owned by one of the executives present. The evidence was irrefutable. Emails, signatures, and timestamps all linked together. The silence grew heavy. Maya didn't stop. Her voice carried through the hall, calm but sharp, narrating each revelation. This document alone shows criminal activity punishable by law. But this is just the beginning. Let's continue. She swiped to the next slide and the horror deepened. Now came tax evasion. Millions hidden offshore, laundered through fake charities and dummy corporations. She highlighted one particular account, an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands. The name tied to it flashed boldly on the screen, and the man sitting in the corner paled, his hands trembling as he reached for a glass of water. The glass shook so violently in his grip that the ice clinked like alarm bells in the silence. Another slide revealed insider trading schemes, trades executed just hours before public announcements, giving these men an illegal advantage that had made them billions over the years. Dates and times lined up too perfectly to deny. The dots connected in neat, damning rows, each one pointing a finger straight at the people in that room. One of the executives finally lost his composure. "This is outrageous," he barked, slamming his palm against the table. "Where did you even get this information? This is confidential." His voice cracked on that last word, exposing the fear beneath his rage. Maya didn't flinch. She simply turned her gaze toward him and said evenly, "Confidential doesn't mean invisible. You've built your empire on the assumption that no one was watching." I was, and I wasn't the only one. The room went still again. The weight of her words pressed down on them like a vice. Then came the final blow. The screen filled with evidence of bribes. Politicians, regulators, and even judges receiving under-the-table payments to look the other way. Maya displayed the wire transfers, the coded emails, the fake invoices. Each one a nail in the coffin. The very foundation of their empire, its reputation, its influence, its supposed untouchability, was revealed for what it truly was: corruption built on lies. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Several executives reached for their phones, frantic to call lawyers, publicists, anyone who could shield them from the storm that was now inevitable. One man tried to leave, but the heavy doors at the back of the hall had already been locked from the outside by security. Not Maya's security, but the summit's own staff who had been instructed to keep the meeting private. There was no escape. Richard, who had been the loudest critic since the beginning, finally spoke again, but his voice had lost its smugness. "You don't understand what you're doing. This will bring everything down. Entire industries will collapse if this goes public." His words trembled between warning and desperation. He was no longer mocking her. He was pleading. Maya didn't blink. "Then let them collapse. If an industry can only survive through lies, then it doesn't deserve to stand." Gasps echoed. The line cut straight through them, leaving nothing to hide behind. The room was spiraling. Papers rustled as trembling hands fumbled with notes. Phones buzzed on the table with alerts, messages already spreading as word of the leak began to reach the outside world. Their carefully guarded empire was unraveling in real time, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. One executive buried his face in his hands, whispering, "We're finished." Another muttered to himself in disbelief, shaking his head over and over, as if denial could undo the evidence glowing on the screen. And in the middle of it all stood Maya, unshaken, her calm presence only magnified by the chaos around her. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't gloating, she wasn't dramatic. She simply stood with the confidence of someone who knew the truth was enough. The truth finally was louder than all of their money, their power, and their arrogance. The realization hit them slowly, like a wave washing over a crumbling castle of sand. Their empire, the empire they thought would last forever, was already gone. Richard's fist came down hard against the polished table, the sharp crack echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. His once arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by raw panic written across his reddened face. He leaned forward, pointing a shaking finger at Maya as though the sheer force of his outrage might undo what she had already done. "You don't know what you're doing. This will ruin everything." His voice broke on the last word, betraying the desperation that was starting to eat through the carefully crafted armor of control he had worn for years. But Maya didn't flinch. She didn't recoil. She didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she stood tall, her expression composed, her tone steady, every word sharpened with conviction. "Exactly. It will ruin everything for you. Not for the people you've stepped on. Not for the businesses you've crushed. Not for the workers you've exploited. For you." The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't disbelief anymore. It was fear. Tangible, suffocating fear. One of the older executives leaned back in his chair, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead, his breathing heavy as though the walls were closing in. Another pulled at his collar, loosening his tie as if fabric alone could choke him. A third tapped furiously on his phone, trying to make calls that wouldn't connect, sending messages that would never erase the truth now spilling into the world. The news was spreading faster than they could contain, each second dragging them deeper into the abyss. Maya's voice cut through the air again, firm and unrelenting. "For years, you've lived under the illusion that money makes you untouchable, that you could write the rules, bend the law, and silence anyone who got in your way. You built walls so high you thought no one could ever see over them. But walls eventually crack, and now everyone can see what's on the other side." Her words landed like hammer blows. The executives, men who were used to being feared, found themselves shrinking in their seats, their carefully tailored suits doing nothing to hide how small they suddenly felt. Richard slammed the table again, though the act lacked the confidence it had before. His eyes darted to the others, looking for support, but none of them would meet his gaze. The room had turned, and they all knew it. "You think this makes you better than us? You think you can destroy us and walk away? Do you know how many people depend on what we've built? Do you understand the damage you're about to cause?" His words were less a threat now, and more an attempt to find an argument strong enough to save him. Maya fixed him with a calm stare. "The damage was done the moment you decided that your greed was more important than people's lives. Every small business you crushed, every competitor you silenced, every family who lost everything while you padded your pockets, those were real people, Richard. The only thing I've done today is take away your ability to hide it." A murmur of panic swept the table. One executive buried his head in his hands, muttering, "It's over. We're finished." Another barked at him to shut up, but the cracks were already showing. The empire wasn't just crumbling on the outside. It was collapsing from within. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, and 2 security officers stepped inside. Their presence was enough to send half the men into a frenzy, shouting over one another, insisting that they had rights, demanding that calls be made, lawyers be brought in. The noise grew louder, more frantic, until it sounded less like a boardroom and more like a cage of desperate animals fighting to escape. But Maya didn't raise her voice above the chaos. Instead, she stepped forward, her calm presence commanding attention until the noise slowly began to fade. When she spoke again, her tone carried an authority that made even the most panicked men freeze. "This isn't just about corruption. This is about accountability. For too long, you've mistaken silence for approval. You thought because no one challenged you, you couldn't be challenged. Today is proof that silence doesn't last forever. And when the truth finally comes, it comes like a flood." Her words rang in the air like a verdict, and none of them could deny it. Phones were still buzzing on the table, vibrating with breaking news alerts. Some of the headlines were already flashing across the big screen as messages poured in faster than they could be silenced. Major corporate scandal exposed. Evidence of fraud sent to authorities. Empire on the brink of collapse. Richard tried to stand, his voice shaking as he pointed at her. "You'll regret this." You think they'll treat you as a hero. The world doesn't change overnight. They'll chew you up just like they did to others who tried to fight us. His words were desperate, almost pleading, as though if he could convince her, maybe he could still salvage something. Maya tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing with focus. You're right about one thing. The world doesn't change overnight. But change always starts somewhere, and sometimes all it takes is a single moment, a single voice to spark it. This, she gestured to the screen glowing with their corruption, is that moment. And no amount of threats will change that. The other executives were silent now, staring down at the table, their faces pale, their hands trembling. Men who had once commanded boardrooms and governments sat like children caught in a lie. The weight of what they were about to lose, power, wealth, reputation, was crashing down on them, and they could already feel it slipping away. Security moved closer, but Maya held up a hand, stopping them for just a moment longer. She wanted her words to be the last thing they heard before their empire fell. Respect isn't demanded by fear or bought with money. Respect is earned, and all of you lost it the moment you decided to treat others as disposable. That's why you're here, facing the consequences. That's why your empire will not survive. Her voice was calm, resolute, final. The shouting didn't return. The room stayed quiet, save for the faint buzzing of phones and the sound of shallow, nervous breaths. Each man sat in the ruins of his own arrogance, and none of them dared to look her in the eye. Maya turned then, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she walked toward the door. Security moved aside, almost deferential, as if they too recognized who truly held power in that room. She didn't look back because she didn't need to. Behind her, the empire was already falling, its once proud rulers reduced to frightened men waiting for the inevitable. By the time she reached the exit, the hall no longer felt like their kingdom. It felt like a graveyard. Maya didn't wait for applause, nor did she pause to watch the faces of the men she had just dismantled crumble under the weight of their own fear. She simply walked. Her heels tapped against the polished marble floor, in a rhythm that echoed power, certainty, and finality. Behind her, the once proud and untouchable executives sat in silence, no longer masters of their empire but prisoners of the truth. Phones buzzed endlessly on the table, spilling headlines faster than their frantic fingers could clear them. Each notification was another nail hammered into the coffin of everything they thought was permanent. The empire they had spent decades building was collapsing in real time, and the sound of it was deafening to them. Even though the hall was quiet, as she stepped through the heavy double doors, the world on the other side was waiting. The flash of cameras nearly blinded her, hundreds of bulbs exploding in rapid succession. Reporters swarmed, their microphones and recorders thrust toward her, their questions colliding into a chaotic storm of voices. Maya, is it true you exposed the board? How long have you had this evidence? Do you realize the market is already reacting? Are arrests expected? Each question was desperate, each reporter hungry to be the first to capture the sound bite that would headline the evening news. But Maya didn't let herself be pulled into their frenzy. She stood tall, letting the cameras click, letting the questions pour over her like waves breaking against rock. And when she finally raised her hand for silence, the crowd obeyed, almost instantly. It wasn't her wealth or her title that commanded them. It was the gravity of what she had just done. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't need to embellish. The truth was already louder than anything else. Her voice, steady and clear, carried across the flashing lights and hushed breaths. Sometimes the biggest empires fall because they forget one simple truth. Never underestimate the person you think doesn't belong. The words sliced through the night air like lightning. For a moment the crowd was silent, and then it erupted in cheers, in applause, in a frenzy of voices shouting her name. Her line spread like wildfire, carried instantly through the microphones, broadcast on live feeds, tweeted and shared, until within minutes it was plastered across every major news outlet and social platform. Memes were made, hashtags trended, and within hours she wasn't just a CEO, she was a symbol. As the crowd pressed closer, Maya's security detail guided her down the steps, but she barely noticed them. Her mind was still sharp, steady, her focus unwavering. She had accomplished what she came to do. The weight of years of being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed had finally lifted. And yet she felt no need for gloating. There was no satisfaction in their destruction, only in the justice that had finally caught up to them. Inside the boardroom, chaos reigned. Phones rang off the hook with lawyers screaming for emergency meetings. Regulators, alerted by the files Maya had already released, began moving swiftly. Federal agents were already drafting warrants. Politicians who once shook hands with these men were now scrambling to distance themselves, publicly condemning what they had so recently benefited from. The empire was being abandoned by its own allies, left to collapse without anyone willing to catch it. For the executives, the fall was merciless. Some were escorted out of the hall in handcuffs before the night was over. Others tried to make frantic deals, calling in favors that no one was willing to grant anymore. Their names hit the headlines one by one, each reputation tarnished beyond repair. Stocks plummeted. Investors pulled out. The institutions they once boasted about being too big to fail fell like dominoes, each crash sending shockwaves through the financial world. The empire wasn't just cracking, it was turning to dust, and through it all Maya's name soared. She was no longer just the CEO of a rising tech company. She became the face of accountability, the proof that the old guard wasn't untouchable anymore. Overnight, her company's value skyrocketed, as investors who once ignored her begged for a seat at her table. The very men who mocked her for being too ambitious or too bold were now irrelevant, their words a forgotten echo in a new era that she had just ushered in. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The image of a black woman standing against a room full of powerful men and tearing down their empire became a story repeated across headlines, talk shows, and social feeds. Students quoted her words in classrooms, activists carried her story into protests, and young entrepreneurs saw in her proof that the barriers they faced weren't walls, but illusions waiting to be shattered. Maya herself, however, wasn't swept away by the noise. She knew that fame was fleeting, but truth was permanent. In interviews, she didn't boast. She spoke about accountability, about the importance of integrity in business, about creating systems where power wasn't hoarded by a few, but shared to build something lasting. She refused to let the spotlight make her arrogant, because she knew arrogance was what had destroyed the men she had just brought down. Richard, the man who had spat, who invited her, at the start of it all, wasn't heard from publicly again for months. When he finally reappeared, it was in court, his once expensive suits traded for the stiff attire of a defendant. His empire gone, his reputation shredded. He sat hunched and hollow, a ghost of the man who had once sneered from the head of a boardroom table. And he would never forget that the downfall began the moment he underestimated Maya Carter. Meanwhile, Maya continued to build. Her company expanded, her influence grew, but she remained grounded in the values that had carried her this far. For her, it was never about proving herself to them. It was about proving to herself and to everyone watching that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming arrogance. She didn't just destroy their empire, she created a new path, one built on resilience, vision, and justice. As she stood on a stage months later, addressing a crowd of thousands at a global leadership summit, she repeated the words that had ignited her rise. Never underestimate the person you think doesn't belong. The audience erupted, and in that moment, Maya Carter wasn't just a CEO. She was a reminder, a warning, and an inspiration rolled into one. The empire of arrogance had fallen, and from its ashes rose something far stronger, a legacy that no amount of wealth or corruption could ever erase.